Hey, welcome everyone to the monthly Ontario calls. We hold these calls every month, every third Thursday from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. And so we feature people who tell their stories about their work that they've done that maybe they personally have faced. We feature different community climate hubs. We featured individuals like we'll hear from today. We featured different climate reality leaders and their accomplishments that they've achieved over their lifetimes. And it's just an opportunity for us to gather, for us to get to know one another, for us to just be in the climate space and find community with each other. And so thank you so much again for joining. I see some people introducing themselves in the chat. That's really great. Keep doing so as the time goes on. We have we as we always we gather upon native land. That was really important to acknowledge that before we get started. And so of course, I encourage everyone to kind of reflect upon where they are joining. A really good resource is nativeland.ca in case you don't know, and I'll put that in the chat there. I'm actually joining from out west, so I'm joining from Vancouver, or the unceded traditional territories of Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. But I know many of you are, of course, probably not over out west here, and so really good to just take this moment to kind of think about where you're situated and how you can hold that in the work that you continue to do this year. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today. And so our guest today is Julia Sterling. And so Julia Sterling achieved a Bachelor's of Global and International Studies with a specialization in globalization and the environment in 2021 from Carleton University. She recently graduated from the Master's of Arts program with the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University in September. And her thesis compared the rapid COVID-19 mobilization efforts to the delayed climate action response in Canada to analyze civil society perspectives about critical lessons learned and potential pathways forward. Julia is passionate about climate justice, alternative knowledge mobilization, and the radical imagination. She is curious about effectively creating spaces for deliberate, constructive dialogue in an increasingly digital and polarized world. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hope. And I will share my screen now. I have a presentation ready for you. So just let me know when you can see that. Are we all good? Yeah, okay. Okay. So before we begin, if available to you, I would really encourage each of you to take out a pen or paper to jot down some reflections you may have throughout, or any questions or anecdotes you would like to discuss after. I'll leave lots of space for that because I love this kind of more dialogic type of presentation. I hold this project very close to my heart, and the goal of it has always been and will continue to be to start important conversations and reflections to motivate and influence action. So I want to express that openness from the beginning. So if you have a pen and paper, just keep it by you as we go today. All right. So if you're here, or if you're here in this chat and a part of this climate community, or merely existing at this time, you may feel that fear and stress induced by ongoing, intensifying climate change. I've felt it in every course I took in my undergrad and master's degrees, every climate disaster I've witnessed in person or on my Instagram feed, and in every day when the weather has felt increasingly unfamiliar. Specifically, there was this one life-altering class in my second year where I studied the latest IPCC report in detail. It was bleak and heavy, as expected, concluding that there were about 12 years to turn things around. I was 20. In 12 years, I would have been 32. I remember leaving one of those classes in my second year with a pit in my heart and in my stomach. The urgency was sharp and serious for me, but when I looked around, everything seemed unchanged. Now, fast forward a few months to March 2020. The World Health Organization announces that the COVID-19 virus is a global pandemic. We all know what follows. An announcement with similarly sharp urgency that actually translated into action. There was an immediacy to the COVID-19 response that we've been told is impossible in the climate context. So I asked myself, as I'm sure many of you did at the time as well, after decades of sounding the climate alarm, why was there political will to mobilize for one crisis and not the other? My thesis narrowed in on the Canadian context. As a settler colonial, extractive, resource-based economy and top per capita global emitter, Canada has the responsibility to uphold agreed upon climate targets. Despite this, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, making it the worst performing of all G7 nations since 2015, far from the efforts required to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. Of its 9 climate plans proposed since 1990, not a single target has been met. This is embarrassing, negligent, and, in my perspective, foolish. It also reflects a serious imbalance when we look at the scale of action observed during the initial stages of COVID-19 outbreak in Canada. This imbalance made me question the relationship between crisis and action, and the importance of learning from these moments that shake us and change us. I wanted to spend the time in conversation with others to reflect on the ways we can learn from one crisis and apply it to the other. At first, I wanted to hear what everyone had to say about this. I'm talking students and government employees and nurses and activists, you know, the works. But with a swift and appreciated reality check from my supervisors, I pared it down to members of civil society organizations active on climate issues. I thought it'd be important to hear from people who've dedicated their careers to advocating, researching, and raising awareness about complex socio-environmental issues. From their seasoned perspective, what are their key takeaways from witnessing the urgency and changes that COVID-19 precipitated? My thesis asked, what have Canadian civil society organizations active on climate issues learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly regarding the role of governments in times of crisis? How can Canada's COVID-19 experience inform and reimagine a more urgent and effective approach to climate action? I selected a wide range of organizations who focus on an array of issues like food insecurity, environmental law, public health, renewable energy, environmental campaigning, Indigenous land rights, and policy analysis. I chose these groups because they exist in this messy middle between the individual, the state, and the corporate world, with the power to hold governments accountable, shape political identities, and ultimately critique or offer alternatives to current policy decisions. As someone entrenched in and frustrated by the doom and heartbreak that often comes with studying these issues, I wanted my thesis to offer a hopeful and imaginative approach to research, much like the core goals of the Climate Reality Project and the reason why we continue to gather in spaces like this today. I designed my interviews to center reflections and opportunities for cross-crisis learning to imagine what is possible when we talk about and mobilize towards climate action in Canada at the scale that we need. Here you can see some of the organizations I spoke with. You might recognize them, but you can see in the environmental civil society landscape, I really tried to diversify some perspectives and their approaches to environmental action. In the 11-hour-long interviews I conducted, I asked each participant to reflect and share their initial reactions to the scale and intensity of the government response to COVID-19. I asked them if policies from the pandemic could inform our climate response or perhaps offer warning signs or gaps that should be considered moving forward. I asked them to reflect on whether the COVID response fundamentally or even superficially challenged any of the core tenets of capitalism and neoliberalism that we know work to exacerbate the climate crisis. During the second part of the interview, I conducted an imaginative futures exercise. Sorry, the letters are a little messy there. Exercise that allowed participants to freely brainstorm what a pandemic-level urgent climate response could look like in Canada. This exercise was motivated by a mentor who once told me that hope can feel like an abstract concept in climate conversations. She said desire for something better can be a stronger catalyst for change. So I asked participants, if we dealt with the climate crisis as a true emergency requiring immediate action, what would that involve? What societal norms and structures could change? How could governance strategies change? What institutions or industries would cease to exist? How might transportation and travel look? Energy, healthcare, wealth distribution, curriculum, agriculture, waste, production, access to nature. What paradigm shift in our worldview could enable this to happen? Without the constraints of the current government, I really encouraged participants to share big ideas as if they had a room full of open hearts and minds. The results were a valiant display of the radical imagination. In the interviews, each participant critiqued the pandemic response while also shining light on what it has proven is possible by providing a glimpse into what a true emergency crisis response looks like at scale. This made me question the role and responsibility of the government to its people and the more than human world it impacts. As a part of my process, I dissected each interview visually, summarizing participants' main thoughts in point form on one page. Here you can see an example of one of my mind maps. This really helped me see similarities across participants, resulting in my apartment floor looking kind of like some kind of color-coded climate conspiracy layer, but it really worked for me to help see a lot of these themes that were consistent throughout. Through this process, participants started to speak about the role that government plays in times of crisis, and I discovered that the COVID response really illuminated 6 roles of government. Government as a supporter, a convener, a communicator, a decision maker, a regulator, and a valuer. I initially wanted to take my results in this direction, but realized that there were broader themes that better encapsulated participant reflections. As qualitative research goes, every interview was beautifully messy and overlapping and contradictory in some ways and tangential, with a myriad of rabbit holes to explore. Again, with great discipline, I narrowed it down to these 4 groups that fit most accurately and naturally. Participants reflected on social supports in times of crisis, the importance of crisis communication, the amplification of political polarization in crisis, and finally, the need for a reorientation of values. First, social supports in crisis. During COVID, there was a shift in norms and public receptiveness to social support programs like CERB, for instance, that challenged neoliberal ideologies that value market freedom, corporate interests, and bootstrapping mentality above all else. It showed that the government can and should serve the health and well-being of its population. Building resilience to climate disasters and achieving a just transition will require a strong social safety net. COVID-19 showed that there is perhaps a cultural shift to accepting this approach. Additionally, COVID-19 reinforced that in times of crisis, we spend whatever it takes, proving that when a crisis is taken seriously, money is no barrier and political will remains the biggest obstacle. This lesson cannot be forgotten as we push for bold action in Canada for the climate crisis that threatens all life on Earth. Next, crisis communication. In this section, I looked at how COVID-19 communication strategies impacted the visibility of crises, the framing of crisis, the delivery of transparent messaging, and ultimately its resonance with the public. First, the frequency and consistency of COVID messaging made its erasure almost impossible, translating to a sense of urgency, attention, and action. COVID was here and now, whereas the climate crisis is still presented as a more distant concern. Next, COVID-19 showed that concerns for human health were a big catalyst for change. A lesson we can learn from this is to perhaps reposition climate conversations around the link between human health and environmental health. This starts to break down that illusion of separateness so intrinsic to anthropocentric colonial worldviews. Finally, participants talked about the need to diversify climate messaging to reach people outside of already pro-environmental spheres. The collective climate movement requires the support of the masses. This means we must diversify messaging to provide different entry points into engagement while still pushing for progressive change without watering down that urgency. COVID showed that the government plays a huge role here. They must commit to and prioritize truth, transparency, and accountability in climate communications to regain public trust and cooperation. This is a big task, but it's energy well spent. Next, COVID exposed a vocal opposition particularly with the Freedom Convoy occupation of the Capitol. The spirit, actions, and motives of the Freedom Convoy are mirrored in stances that delay climate action, mainly individualism, fear, hate, and othering. This is an ideological and cultural divide. Climate action demands a shift towards collective action and well-being. One participant asks, how do we learn from this to communicate in a way where we are still telling the truth about the equity issues at play, but also not alienating people or not pouring gas on the fire that is this hyper-polarized political context right now, where some groups are determined to see anything that has to do with equity as hyper-wokeism. Participants suggested that there must be a return to deliberative democratic dialogue to counteract the hate and division that delays progress. The government can perhaps play a role in this process as a convener by adopting a citizens' assembly model that could help inform climate solutions that meet the needs of diverse communities. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Finally, in the imaginative futures exercise, participants called for a foundational reorientation of values that dismantles the dominant paradigm upheld by ongoing legacies of colonialism, anthropocentrism, and patriarchy. How do we achieve this? By perhaps adopting a more ecological paradigm that uproots and counteracts anthropocentrism and colonialism, by redefining the idea of what it means to live a good life, away from individualism and hyperconsumption, and restores a stronger sense of connection with each other and the more than human world. Participants talked about denaturalizing the billionaire class, hyperconsumption, and individualism towards equitable wealth distribution, living in good relation with others, and reconnecting with community and nature in whatever sense that may be. I turned these ideas into a graphic mind map to visualize participants' thoughts. Each shade of the bubbles represents a different participant, and the headings at the top encompass the underlying theme that unites each point. As you can see, just from reading through, there were lots of different ideas that were proposed. At this point, I'll take a brief pause here to allow any thoughts you have stirring in your brain, perhaps, about this imagined world to find a place on your page. After my presentation, we will build a mind map together. So I don't want maybe some of those ideas that are swimming around right now to go to waste. So I'll just give us a minute to maybe be inspired by some of these ideas on the page and write down anything that's stirring inside of your brain right now. So I'll give us a minute to do that. Okay. All right. The results of this thesis push Canada to treat the climate crisis with the same level of urgency and seriousness seen during the pandemic. Not to create a paralyzing, short-lived response or a band-aid solution, but instead to adjust our society and economy to be compatible with a healthy, just, and sustainable world. Like COVID-19, the impacts of the climate crisis are terrifying, and that's an understatement. What we do with this fear in this next decade will define life on Earth. Each one of us has a role to play in building this future, and every one of us has a role to play in actively remembering the very recent scale of action we've been shown is possible. It will take work, and it will take organizing, and it will take emotional resilience. But in tribute to the recent Martin Luther King Jr. Day, Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. I think that rings true to the ongoing war with the planet, the war within ourselves, and the ongoing war with each other at various scales. I'd love to open up the floor now to any questions or reflections you may have about this work before we head into our collaborative imaginative futures section that I'm really excited for all of you to try out.
Feel free also, if you don't have a question now, you can always put it in the chat and we can always address it later too.
Yeah. Lella.
That was awesome, Janet. Julia, I'm just letting things sit a little, but I'm interested in hearing a little bit more on the Citizens Assembly idea and where that came from, because I have been pushing for this in my own way as well. So I'm kind of interested in where that sort of surfaced and and kind of what you've heard.
So that's an exciting topic that I would love to hear about how your, efforts to mobilize in your own world. Because it's always one of those things that I think people have lots of theorizing about, but it's hard to envision what that could look like at a community scale. But the root of it was in that political polarization discussion, talking about how COVID, even before COVID, we were an extremely digital world, very in these like online spaces, and we all know how algorithms are feeding us back what we engage with most. And I think that's creating even more of a divide and some critical conversations that we need to be having right now. And COVID only amplified that digital space. And people's responses or reflections about wanting some kind of return to a deliberate democratic dialogue is what a lot of people were kind of, or that's what I referred to it as in my work, is reinvigorating some of those spaces for convening where you have intergenerational approaches to understanding world issues, people in different expertise, people with different life experiences, gathering to have conversations about how we're navigating this and the different perspectives that we bring. And one that I was exploring in my research was sort of again, it's hard to figure out how you can have a representative sample of a community or a region because, humanity is very diverse, but the idea was to have kind of like 100 group sample of various demographics that are prepped, people coming from different familiarity with the topic at hand, but then they're prepped with history and some briefing notes to get people semi on the same page, just caught up about the information that we'd be discussing, and then some kind of facilitated dialogue and how that can inform community needs that are actually relevant to those policies would be serving, rather than kind of a top-down assumptive approach. Right now, I think the root of so much political tension is that we have very few ways to engage democratically with our system beyond a 4-year voting cycle, in which our representatives might not even represent the issues that are top of mind to a lot of citizens. And so it puts us in this frustrating position that I think then we turn online in these like very divisive ways that are not very productive. And so I'm inspired by the need to reconvene some of those community spaces that might have existed in the past. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about maybe examples where you're seeing that happen. Yeah, I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up all the conversation from others, but so having some background and some experience with citizens assemblies, the actual how do I say this? Like there is a set process, right? And they are kind of one-time events. But I hear in your response, Julia, which I also like, that there are, different forms and a number of different ways to get people re-engaged or engaged for the first time in a democratic process. So I think that's all really cool. And I feel like there is a lot of room and opportunity for that at the municipal and community level right now. There seems to be a lot of momentum building at the very hyper local level for people to connect again.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a good place to start. So I think that that's really, really cool. And I had some kind of wacky, weird ideas about that. But also, I just really am a fan of citizen assemblies, just having seen them work. And they do, in fact, there is a very set process about how they reflect the actual demographics of a society. And the one piece that I think is really key with the citizens assembly in that context is the fact, the learning aspect. So this shouldn't be, but it is a very political topic right now. It's being treated that way, and so the information that people would receive in the process of having that dialogue, I think, is really important, because that in itself could be divisive and could be contested by people, right? So one of the ideas behind the Citizens Assembly is that there are very neutral sources of information, experts from all kinds of different angles of the issue, that present and educate and take questions and answer questions. And it's a whole learning aspect that happens as part of that. Which I think is really important, because I think I'll stop now, but I think one of the things that is added to the polarization and just the antagonism that's felt online particularly is this sort of switch from people learning or interested or eager to learn, and people just basically opining on things, right? So there isn't really this sort of sharing of information as much as a sharing of what people think and opinion. So anyhow, I'll stop there, but yeah, I'm really interested in that whole aspect of, because I think it is really key for people to be engaged in a democratic process in order for us to address this kind of an existential question and all of the issues that are interconnected with it.
Thank you. There's some points in the chat. So Herb said, writing, phoning, email, and communicating with local MPs and MPPs en masse is very powerful. In Ontario, it reversed the province's Greenbelt decision and has prevented several gas plants from being built. Communicating with MPs, an undervalued and underappreciated yet powerful tool. I think that's a really good point, Herb, and I think that there's an opportunity there, even with a citizens assembly, or even just thinking about our collective power. And I think that also comes from collective awareness. And so how are we educating, and how are we then understanding our own agency in dictating policy? And that it's not all hopeless. And I think that that's a powerful example of that is with the reversing Greenbelt decision. I know there's also a lot of work on the 413 highway and getting a lot of pushback. And so that's another example of that very locally as well. And I think that ties in with Lala's point just about the municipal power at the local level. Kevin, much of the COVID response was dictated by global governments. Doesn't political policy need to drive change in order to make it happen? Did the groups you interviewed offer any strategies to keep the government accountable for the targets and actions they have committed to in light of never hitting any in the past? Great question. One of the that you'll see on this mind map here is looking at decision making. And one of the ideas that was brought up in my interviews was this idea of like legislated long-term thinking, and the danger of a 4-year political cycle is that a lot of climate gains that are made in one tenure can be completely reversed, but nature doesn't stop. Like the natural course of climate degradation will not stop because a policy is now reversed. And so we need a shift, and that ties back into a reorientation of values around valuing nature as a protected entity and having our decision-making processes directly tied to that. And it's no longer about tree huggers or a green policy. This is about our population's survival and the survival of all life. And I think that the sanctity of that, the seriousness of that needs to start being embedded in decision-making processes. And one of the ways that was discussed in my research was through like legislated long-term thinking, and mandated rights of nature was another one from an eco-justice perspective, which is an environmental law firm. She was working on, like, representative there was working on that kind of rights of nature work, rather than the consequences of our extractivism always being, you know, kind of put onto the natural environment as this kind of, all of the costs of our consumption and extraction are just kind of placed on the environment as if that is like a zero, ground zero. So now adding either a financial value to that, consequences, or just outright protection. And so people are discussing this in many different ways, and it's exciting to see that value shift. But I think it comes down to that prioritization of the health of nature and the health of our well-being as well, which is one of the biggest points in the reorientation of value section on this mind map. And hopefully that answered your question. Externalities, yeah. Keith Kennedy, what age groups did your responders come from? Were you not dealing with the already converted NGOs? So good question, Keith. A lot of the age groups I would say were around 30 to 50-year-old professionals. They, yes, were already in the already converted environmental NGO space. And I mentioned at the beginning, like, I envisioned this project to be much larger with like lots of different stakeholder engagement, from I guess both sides, the non-converted, as you would say. But there were constraints of it just being a year and funding runs up, and I was one researcher. And so I wanted to ask those who have already dedicated their careers to pushing for climate action to see like what their reflections were about this other crisis that gained all of this momentum and seriousness and urgency. So I thought they would bring a really valuable perspective about that comparison. And I think your thought was not lost on me, and I wanted to do that, but it was just a matter of time, really. I believe long-term climate policy outlived the current 4-year or less political cycle. Has that been tested? I believe there was one in Wales, I want to say, but I would have to check that back out again. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's what one of the participants suggested. So it has been tested elsewhere, but would be an interesting concept to bring into the Canadian context. I find that while there are ways, yes, more is better, but that is rather a big ask. Keith gets it. I have found that while there are ways to impact decision makers, elected representative corporate entities are much more difficult to reach. They seem made of Teflon, and ordinary citizens are much more apt to criticize or confront government than to criticize or confront corporations. Thoughts about that? I think that's built into our neoliberalism. Really upholds this idea of like cutting the red tape and government basically being a hindrance on corporate success. And so that's an underlying culture and society that we're working within right now. And so critiques feel like it's going against that cultural norm when we critique corporations. But again, you're talking about the same scrutiny more scrutiny on the part of government and rather than on corporations. I believe that there should be an expectation of transparency in both parties. But governments are the role of government is to support its citizens' well-being, and I think that's started to get lost in our acceptance of austerity, continued austerity, cutting of social services, from healthcare, like some of the core foundations of our society, the care economy, which all life depends on education and healthcare, making sure we are healthy, happy, educated. These maintain our society and are continuously the ones targeted for reductions in funding. And yeah, I think that there needs to be criticism on both ends and I think that's a healthy democracy, but I think there also needs to be we're starting to see that with the ESG regulations for corporations, putting more rigid constraints on them that are mandated, but I still think there's just such a strong history of governments working in favor of corporate interests and leaving those loopholes open for corporations to continue to, business as usual, despite the ethical, environmental concerns that are very apparent. And I think that is deeply tied to Canadian federal interest as well. We can't ignore that when Canada owns, I think it's 75% of global mines. We have a deeply strong interest in extractive industries, and so it's working together. And I think that needs to be made more obvious, and we need to call that into question a lot more, which then goes back to education and awareness. And I think I always kind of return to that as the first step in citizen engagement and where we're convening those spaces and how. We need a lot of good teachers and that are supporting critical thinking. Change at corporations needs to be driven by government policy, like the recent ban on plastics and single-use plastics. What would your interviewees rank as the most impactful new government policies to change behaviors? That's a good question. We didn't really go into that as much in my research. I would say that the ESG route is taking the right angle in that it's mandated, and organizations or corporations are now having to enforce that and ensure that money is going there. I still think that there's a lot more to be done, and ESGs can be a route to greenwashing organizations without doing the excavating a lot of where majority of the emissions are coming from within organizations. But I think we're on the right track in terms of mandating emissions reductions, changing power structures within corporations, whether that's changing their funding streams, which stakeholders they're most serving. Again, I didn't explore that much in my research, so this is kind of off the cuff, but I'll go on to the next one. A good start, Julia. Have you discussed this outcome with Louise Como at Carleton, or perhaps you have, and what was her feedback? Have not, don't know Louise, but I will make a note. Louise Como. Yes, RE Climate is okay, cool. I work climely with RE Climate. Chris Russell was my third reader for my paper, actually, and he's very tied with climate comment. The RE Climate. I think that's a great start with our reflections on what I've shared so far, but I really want to try this exercise with you if you're willing. So I've created something called a Padlet. So if everyone has access to a QR code, how am I doing for time? Do we have time for this kind of 10-minute exercise? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Whoops.
Do you by chance have the link?
Yep, I'm gonna put it in the chat right now. So this link you can go to directly, or you can use the QR code. And if everyone can just post maybe a thumbs up when they've been able to access the link. Should look like this when you open up your page. Okay. Yeah, so if you are in, this would be a great place to share some of those ideas that I told you to kind of, I asked you to jot down in the middle of my presentation. So we can start dropping some ideas here. What's really cool about this feature is that you can comment on other people's ideas too. So I have the prompt posted there, so I'll read it again out loud. If we dealt with the climate crisis as a true emergency requiring immediate action, what could that involve? What societal norms and structures could change? How could government strategies change? What institutions or industries would cease to exist? And how might transportation and travel look? Energy, healthcare, wealth distribution, curriculum, eating habits, agriculture, waste, production, access to nature? What paradigm shift in our worldviews could enable this to happen? And you'll be able to participate by using the plus button and then typing a subject. So I will go off camera now, so there isn't a ton of pressure, and maybe we'll monitor how things are posting. And I'll talk as we go. I guess I don't have to go off camera. That's fine. Okay. Great. So we have more money for a just transition. So funds would not go towards oil and gas, but instead green technologies. Stop selling our electricity to the US from BC and Quebec. So localized energy systems. Active in public transportation would be a priority. Yeah, you know, what could that look like in your local context? I'd be interested to hearing how transportation is looking in your urban centers or rural areas. In Ottawa, it looks like reliable subway system and affordable. Investment into next generation infrastructure, examples, electric vehicles. Non-fossil fuel energy sources for heating and cooling buildings, district energy, geothermal, and heat and other heat pumps. Yeah, I've been hearing lots more about heat pumps and yeah, different ways of heating. So that's an exciting like budding industry. Mixed use, high density communities. Yeah, I think that we're definitely in a pretty outrageous housing crisis right now. And so how does the housing market adapt to these more high density communities? Incentives for community-based investment options for our next generation energy and infrastructure needs. Community-based investment options, cool. Centering care over profit, ensuring that no one is left behind when creating a new system of lowering our emissions. Also allowing investment into low carbon jobs, education, healthcare over investment into larger private corporations. Infrastructure for bikes, wagons, walking would be the focus and road improvements would be secondary. Interesting. So moving away from that car-centric approach to urban planning is a theme. Accelerating approval for clean tech innovations and rapid pilots for municipalities. So that's like really focused on innovation and how are we allowing for innovation to happen, you know, easily. So reducing some of those barriers, say to up capital upfront. Cool. Are there any thoughts about Yeah, curriculum perhaps, or eating habits. Any thoughts about agriculture or waste and production or consumption habits, ideology shifts, anything of that is welcome. Information or communication and ideas, meetings happening regularly in each community. Interesting. So that kind of ties in with our citizens assembly discussion. This is great. Regenerative agriculture, regenerative forestry, regenerative oceanic aquaculture. So really focusing on long-term ecosystem health in the way we're eating, and not that being secondary or unique, but being the core basis of our agriculture system is very wise. You could go for a walk on the Queensway, so more yeah, more walkable communities I think is a big deal, and I think that also starts to fall in line with that same idea about whoops. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I can move it around. Cool. Understanding what is sustainability versus what really is sustainability, and with the reset, drive new expectations for clean tech. Tax incentives and penalties based on environmental behavior. That's really interesting as well. So making sure people are motivated to make the switch. Centering care over profit. Oh, I reduced that. Yeah. More use of land in the city for growing food. So urban agriculture, very interesting. There's something called guerrilla gardening. I'm not sure if anyone has heard of that, but that's a really fascinating um idea about, yeah, kind of planting seeds. It started as I think in the Bronx in New York, a guy just started planting seeds, like edible plants, in small patches of land in the city, and it started to create this kind of like guerrilla gardening. So that's a really interesting thing to think about, and how our urban spaces are adapting to these changes. More money for transition. So develop the capacity to produce our own solar panels. 2, reduce migration influx in population growth, as population growth is at the heart of much economic stress in the short term. Interesting. Require building and home efficiency heating and cooling as they have done in many of the EU countries. Stop selling our hydropower. So renegotiate the transboundary water agreements. Changing zones and building codes would be implemented immediately, and all development projects already improved would be on hold until they can meet them, with some allowances for affordable housing. So interesting. Thinking about rezoning. I'm getting lost in the sauce now. Education of youth to drive green values. They are the voters of tomorrow. Wilding of city boulevards and parks. Side management hopefully could encourage better reduction strategies in terms of consumption of goods, power, as we realize that we can't buy our way into sustainability. Emphasizing communicating the wins, positive benefits. Oh, where did that go? Oh, here we go. Positive benefits, hope in the transition, particularly the economic benefits, as this is what concerns so many people. I think that's a really good one. I'll just make everyone aware too, you can like and comment on other people's. I think this is a great, I want to be, sorry, did someone say something? No, okay. Yes, no, okay. Shift to plant-based food systems. Start by eliminating subsidies to industrial agriculture, animal agriculture, making plant-based healthy meals default in hospitals, returning land back to animal habitat. 80% of farmland worldwide is used by animal agriculture, mainly cattle ranching and carbon sequestration losses. Wow, we have so many amazing ideas here, and I hope that this can feel energizing for all of you. I can save this Padlet and share it back at the end of the call for you to return to and engage with, and start thinking about these ideas more broadly. I really love all these thoughts, and I just want to say that within all of this, even though it can feel very high level, there are ways that we can advocate for this in our day-to-day lives, in our own communities, in our own workplaces. We have so much power at our fingertips with the networks that we're already involved in. I think it's important to remember it doesn't, being a good like taking this seriously and actively engaging in climate work doesn't mean dropping everything and starting your own NGO or something like that. It's working with what we already have, what you're good at, and the networks that you're already plugged into. And that's where so much power already lays and so much agency is. So I really encourage you to think about your own lives differently in that sense. And, you know, some of the prompts that Hope and Janet wanted me to share, we're just talking. I mean, I'm going to pause this right now. Feel free to keep reflecting. I'm going to have this Padlet open, but I'm just going to shift back to a slide that I have here. Yeah, share away, everyone. And you can keep sharing afterwards and reflect using that same link. Yeah, so some of the ways I'll just briefly conclude. Some of the ways you can get involved locally are with organizations that are in your area that are doing really important work, or education. I've found that in two organizations here. One of them is called the Climate Commons, and that's at Carleton University. They do weekly teach-ins called Noons for Now. Every Thursday at noon, they have a different specialist come in and have a very loose conversation every week. It's not very lecture style. It's very like dialogic. So lots of opportunity for engagement there. It's a great way to learn in these like bite-sized chunks and meet some pretty awesome people doing incredible work. And if they're not doing climate work themselves, they're engaged, and then you meet people and it starts to spiral from there. So I find that a really energizing space, and I always leave with lots of ideas flowing. And then the second organization I wanted to talk about was my recent involvement with the All We Can Save project. And this was originally an anthology. So all of these different works from climate activists, whether they were essays, research papers, poems, all these different works that were put into this novel to read, that slowly spiraled into reading groups of people kind of reading these anthologies together and reflecting on them. And then the All We Can Save project took it one step further to do a climate wayfinding program, which I had the pleasure of participating in over the summer. And through this wayfinding program, it was a free program. You got to you had to apply for it, and then if you were accepted, there were about 15 of us in the cohort. I was one of 3 Canadians that were there. Everyone else was from the States, and we met every week for 2 hours for 5 weeks, and it really walked us through reflecting on our own motivations in climate work, our own skills, what feels energizing to us, and what feels motivating. And then we explored different career paths that we could go into, but also different work outside of maybe a career path, how we can engage more locally, coming up with plans of things we're actually going to do post program to more actively engage in climate spheres that we're attached to. It was really inspiring. I loved their approach. I speak very highly of the program if you're interested. I know they're doing climate facilitator work now, where you can join a course as a facilitator to kind of create these same programs on the ground, either in educational institutions or in workplaces. Really great team, super knowledgeable and careful about the way that they're approaching a lot of this work. They're not afraid to get to the heavier emotions that underpin a lot of climate work, and I found that very refreshing to touch on, rather than just leaving it at the very depressing facts often. More than happy to answer any questions you have via email about those 2 programs. Can't recommend them enough, and I encourage you to do the same about how you can plug into some of those networks wherever you live. And I find that has been the biggest source for me to be able to continue this kind of work when things can get very low, to have people you can resonate with and connect with in that capacity is really important for sticking with this work, because we have to be in it for the long haul. Yeah. So finally, I'll leave you with one reflection. What have we learned from what we've been shown is possible? Those are my contact information. I know it's annoying that some of the letters are on different lines. I translated it from Canva to PowerPoint before this, and it got a little janky, but that's okay. yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I am currently looking for full-time work. I will just, toss that out there as well. I graduated in September, and so I've been doing these workshops as a lunch and learn for different organizations and around campuses in the meantime, and have really enjoyed being able to continue my research in this capacity. But yeah, I'd look forward to connecting with all of you, and thanks for tuning in.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. This was really, really wonderful. And I am sure I speak for everyone that that was really, really excellent. And I learned so much, and I'm so glad I recorded it. I was like many times during this, I was like, this is great. I'm so happy that people can watch this back. I think my colleague, Michaelina, who isn't able to join tonight, I think she would love to watch this back. I just know it would be right up her alley. So yeah, really, really excited. To be able to share this afterwards. And I'm so happy that everyone was so participative in the Padlet. That's really cool. I haven't used Padlet before. So it's always fun to learn a new little kind of interactive site. So I'm glad that that also now can exist for a while. Does that delete ever, or will that link kind of stay populated?
I will get back to you about that, because I think there's a way to save it as
Okay.
sort of like a JPEG. And I can share that with you if you want to post this and then like attach that to it. I can share that resource back with you. I don't think it stays live though. Once I like close it. But yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great.
We'll share whatever product it gives me.
Yeah. Sounds great.
I'm still learning with it myself. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I will actually stop the recording now because we have another half an hour, and it's nice to always have a little bit of an open room for discussion in case anyone wants to like chat more. I know we've been really having a really great discussion in the chat, but in case anyone wants to come off or like, continue on, I'll stop recording now so that we have a little bit more space too.